Ever since its inception in 2010, NXT has been all about one mission, and that's build the future of WWE. As you would expect then, this has meant a lot of promising talent have passed through the brand over the years. So much so, in fact, that for every year of its existence, there has been at least one standout performer. But just who was the best wrestler of every single year? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with 2010 and Wade Barrett. Yes, back when the developmental brand was still in its original game show incarnation, it was a very different show to what it would later become. And because of that, it meant that a certain Bryan Danielson and Low Ki aside, there wasn't much in the way of top talent from super indies like Ring of Honor to be found here. Rather, what we had was people who were first getting started out for the most part and were learning those early ropes inside the WWE system, similar to what NXT is today. That said, it wasn't like these were a bunch of performers who were too green to do anything yet. No, there were some diamonds to be found amongst this early batch of the brand, and the number one amongst them has to be Wade Barrett. Why Wade Barrett? Well, because of that original NXT class, he was the one both WWE and its fans clearly saw the most in. Hell, that was exactly why after season 1 of the show came to an end, it would be the Englishman who was standing tall as the winner. And once the Nexus decided to invade the main roster not long after this, it would be Barrett who was positioned as the leader of the faction. In fact, if things had gone just a little differently for the Nexus, there's a good chance the former bare-knuckle boxer would have had a full-blown main event run at some point, but sadly, that was not meant to be. Still though, none of this can take away from the fact that, of that original NXT class, Wade Barrett was the one seen to have the most potential at the time. When it came to 2011, however, he'd no longer be eligible for the spot of Best Developmental Wrestler. No, instead, that mantle would be passed on to our next subject, Derek Bateman. Now, we should clarify here that Derek Bateman didn't rise to the top of the pile during NXT Season 2 as you might expect. No, by the time 2011 came around, we were already in Season 4 of the show, with Seasons 2 and 3 seeing the rise of stars such as AJ Lee, Bray Wyatt, and Naomi. So by this stage in the game, the format was well established with fans. And that meant it was a lot harder to stand out, something which the future EC3 luckily didn't have a problem with. Why was that? Well, when it came to Bateman, he had enough charisma to be able to grab people's attention early on during his NXT run. And this would be enough to see him go far in the tournament. Sure, it wouldn't be enough to see him win. Rather, he'd end up finishing 3rd place behind Brodus Clay and Johnny Curtis, aka Fandango. That said, one look at the wrestling landscape over the last few years will tell you exactly which one of these three went on to have the most success, as in the time since, the Ohio native has gone on to have successful runs in places such as TNA and Billy Corgan's National Wrestling Alliance. And it all started here on NXT, the place where he first broke out from the pack and made a name for himself as the muscle-bound rookie to Daniel Bryan, who for a while there seemed like a dead cert for superstardom on the WWE main roster. So much of a dead cert did he seem to be, in fact, during Season 5 of NXT, the last one in its original game show format, and the one which saw past losers return for a second chance. Bateman seemed like he was on the verge of winning, right up until the show was cancelled before it could reach its conclusion, in fact. That's right, he was very nearly able to guarantee that main roster contract here. Sadly though, he would not at this time. And that meant by the time 2012 came around, the WWE fanbase would have moved on to another standout star of the NXT brand, Seth Rollins. Of course, it should have been obvious that Seth Rollins would be the standout here, as 2012 was pretty much the perfect year for him to arrive on NXT. And we say that because this was the year that the brand morphed from its original game show format into being more of a traditional developmental show. So because Seth was one of the best performers in the US indie scene at this point, what with his work in Ring of Honor speaking for itself and all, he had no problem slotting into the role of early ace of the promotion. So much would he stand out here, in fact, when it came time for the Black and Gold brand to crown its first ever world champion, it would be the Architect who was selected for this spot. And once he was the champ, he'd go on a reign of dominance, all while helping NXT to turn into one of the most must-see things out there in the industry. Obviously then, for this reason alone, there really can be no other choice for Best Act on the developmental show for 2012. It's just an easy person to go with, given all he accomplished here. Was the choice as easy when it came to 2013, however? Well, yes and no, because while there would be even more great talent who make their way through the doors of NXT during this 12-month period, in the end, there really could be only one choice again for who the best performer there was, and that's none other than Big E Langston. Come on now, this is another one which should have been obvious. After all, by the time the black and gold brand was really starting to root itself inside the WWE system as something which was going to be around for the long haul, Big E was busting out of the pack in a major way. And the way he was doing this was by being an absolute physical specimen who, early on, got over with his count the fall until 5 gimmick, something first used by King Kong Bundy back in the day. Sure, he might have been the world's nicest guy behind the scenes, but on screen, he was a fearsome figure, someone who everyone watching knew could destroy them at a moment's notice should he choose to do so. As you would expect then, with all this power behind him, it wouldn't be long before Big E was challenging Seth Rollins for the NXT World title. And not just challenging him, but beating him. That's right, long before anyone ever truly got the better of the Shield on the main roster, Langston was making mincemeat out of them on the developmental show, and this led to him becoming the second ever world champion there. So when you talk about the best people to grace black and gold in 2013, there really is no other option. Really, had he not been called up to Raw soon thereafter, he probably would have been the best of 2014 as well. But Big E was called up, and so instead, when we talk about the best NXT act of 2014, we have to instead look toward our next subject, a man who would carry the whole thing over to a golden era, a man who went by the name of Adrian Neville. Yes, as 2014 arrived, the developmental brand was starting to transform again, not in format this time, but instead in terms of overall popularity. And the reason for that was because with the show now airing on the WWE Network, and with their quarterly takeover shows beginning, NXT suddenly became the coolest thing in all of North American wrestling, as the quality of work on display there was way ahead of everything else around it. And while this golden era of the show was taking effect, there was one man standing on top of the mountain, Adrian Neville. Just as well he was there then, because with his absolutely incredible athletic ability, the man currently known as Pac was the perfect person to catch the attention of this new incoming audience. Hell, it was him playing the subtle heel to Sami Zayn's Man of the People babyface, which really served as the black and gold brand's first truly great story. And when the Newcastle native eventually dropped the belt to the future honorary Uce, it would be a euphoric moment for fans to witness. Sure, Adrian Neville might never have been the heart and soul of NXT in the same way that Zayn was, and he may not have been the fresh young face that his fellow countrywoman Paige was around the same time, but in 2014, there were few who could outperform him in the ring. Come 2015, though, the torch he was carrying would well and truly have been passed over to our next subject, Finn Balor. Okay, if 2014 was the year NXT started becoming something truly special, then 2015 was the year it finally arrived, as the likes of Kevin Owens, The Revival, and the Four Horsewomen all fully hit the scene. But while each of these was crucial to the success of the black and gold brand in their own way here, none were quite as crucial as Finn Balor. And the reason for that was because, hot off a run in New Japan Pro Wrestling as one of the top junior heavyweights in the world, the man formerly known as Prince Devitt would quickly take over the main event scene down in Florida with his great in-ring work. But it wasn't just his great in-ring work which made him stand out here, of course. No, there was also his excellent character work personified by his demon alter ego, which was bust out for special matches. That's right, whenever it came time for a takeover show, the Irishman was going to win the bout before things even got in the ring, purely based on his ability to psych his opponents out with his entrance. And once that was done, it was easy pickings for him, as come the end of the year, he'd be standing tall as the NXT World Champion, with this being a belt he'd go on to hold for 292 days thereafter. Really, if there was anyone you could call the ace of black and gold era NXT, then Finn Balor would be it, as he was the face many today would still most commonly associate with such a great period of wrestling. That said, even if his world title run continued well into 2016, he would not be the best wrestler of that year on that particular brand. Rather, this accolade would go to Shinsuke Nakamura instead. Okay, if you weren't around at the time, then it needs to be made clear just how big of a deal this was in 2016. As while Prince Devitt had certainly been a popular guy in New Japan Pro Wrestling before arriving in NXT, that was nothing compared to Shinsuke Nakamura. No, in the King of Strong style, you had one of the biggest stars in Puro Riso history, someone good enough to be an IWGP Heavyweight Champion multiple times over, as well as a Tokyo Dome main eventer. So when it came out that he was going to WWE then, fans were immediately excited, as this was a true game changer of an act jumping ship. And boy, were these fans not disappointed, as upon arrival on the black and gold brand, Shinsuke hit it out of the park right away by having a 5-star classic with Sami Zayn at TakeOver Dallas, a match which to this day might still stand as NXT's best. Then, once he was done doing that, the Kyoto native would round out the year by winning the NXT World title from Samoa Joe on 2 separate occasions, with this making him the first babyface to ever hold the gold multiple times. Really, what Shinsuke Nakamura signaled more than anything else here, though, was signal that NXT was now the place to be if you were serious about becoming a great wrestler in North America. And that only further helped create a sense of cool around the brand, which the main roster just didn't have back then. So obviously it only made sense that as 2017 came around, the best of the best would keep jumping over to Florida, including our choice for the best of that year, Asuka. What made Asuka such a force of nature in 2017? Well, as the 4 horsewomen of Sasha Banks, Becky Lynch, Charlotte Flair, and Bayley were all moving on to the main roster, it was the Empress of Tomorrow who picked up their mantle and ran with it. And the way she did this was by completely dominating the field, beating each and every person who went up against her, usually in short order. Of course, if you are aware of her work prior to this over in Japan as Kana the Murder Clown, however, then her success would come as no surprise. Even then, though, you might not have expected her to be so successful, as after beating Bayley to win the NXT Women's title at TakeOver Dallas, the Osaka native would go on a 522-day-long run on top, a record which still has never been beaten to this day. Yes, throughout 2016, more so than any other woman or any other man, Asuka was the clear ace of NXT. Hell, by the time her run on developmental came to an end, her legend would be so strong that she'd have entered into the area of myth, largely on account of the fact that she was still undefeated. That said, while Asuka remained on top of the women's division throughout 2018, she wasn't the top act in the promotion anymore. No, by then, a man had come up to take her place, a man who just so happened to be a key part of NXT's greatest ever storyline, and our next subject, Tommaso Ciampa. Now, there are other contenders for the moniker of greatest storyline in NXT history, of course, with the initial rise of Sami Zayn and the saga of the 4 horsewomen being 2 of the more notable examples. Hell, some would even look to the 2.0 era as well, where things like the Carmelo Hayes and Trick Williams rivalry had a lot of success. Still though, if you were to take a poll of fans, then the peak of the entire brand would likely be considered to be the feud between Tommaso Ciampa and Johnny Gargano. Obviously then, if we were picking one person as the star act of NXT during 2018, it would have to be one of these two, as the whole epic angle revolved around each man equally. But there can only be one choice for the top dog here. So in choosing, we've had to take into consideration which one achieved the most here. And for our money, that would be Ciampa, because despite being the heel in the situation, he was the one who managed to win the NXT World title first when he beat Aleister Black for the honor on the July 18th episode of the Black and Gold brand's weekly TV show. Sure, he would have to eventually vacate this belt as a result of injury, but that wouldn't happen until 2019. When it came to the year prior to that, though, the Blackheart would be on top of the world down in the developmental brand, as with his dastardly antics he was, for a while there at least, one of the most effective heels in all of wrestling. Hell, had it not been for the rise of an even more over heel in 2019, Ciampa would likely have retained his spot as the best NXT wrestler. But that person did rise to the top, so high in fact that they'd become the face of the brand. Who are we talking about here? Why, Adam Cole, of course. Seriously though, how lucky were NXT to have Adam Cole in 2019? As with AEW now competing with them every Wednesday night, there was now a rival to the developmental brand. And NXT's ace in the hole was able to keep things thriving as, after winning the NXT World title on June 1st of that year, the Panama City Playboy would carry the brand into this new stage of their existence. That's right, every week on NXT TV, you were pretty much guaranteed to get a great segment from Cole and his Undisputed Era stablemates as they proceeded to completely take over the show. And whenever takeover time came around, he was always ready to deliver a killer main event. When it comes to 2020, however, that MVP mantle would have shifted again as it went back over to the women's division in order to be placed over the head of our next subject, Io Shirai. Of course, this is another case where it should have been obvious who was going to get the nod here. Come on now, back in 2020, there was arguably no better wrestler on the entire WWE roster than Io Shirai. And that was something she proved each and every time she stepped inside of the ring against any opponent who was put up against her. Thank God this was the case then, because with this being the year that the world went into lockdown, NXT were in desperate need of someone who could steer the ship through some very rocky waters. What would some of Io's highlights be during 2020? Well, for one, this would be the year that she finally reached the mountaintop to become the NXT Women's Champion, something she did by beating both Charlotte Flair and Rhea Ripley in the same match. and once she had the belt around her waist, the Genius of the Sky would hold it throughout the remainder of the year. Hell, by the time she was done, her reign would have lasted for a full 304 days and would see her beat opponents such as Candice LeRae, Dakota Kai, and Toni Storm. So really, could there ever be any other choice for Best NXT Wrestler of 2020? Really, this was the taster for what would come later, when Shirai eventually joined the main roster and became the best wrestler there too. Of course, her eventual call-up to that main roster meant she wouldn't still be on the developmental brand when 2021 came around, and because of that, the mantle of best wrestler on the show would instead move over to someone else, someone by the name of Mandy Rose. Now, 2021 was a very important year for NXT because it was the year that the whole thing changed from Black and Gold to 2.0. Needless to say then, given how beloved the Black and Gold era had been, this transformation was a rocky one, as it took fans a while to get used to the new version. But then this should have been expected, as now no longer was the show serving as the super indie it had been before, rather it was serving as a true developmental league. Interestingly though, it wouldn't be a rookie who served as the best wrestler within this new paradigm. No, it would be someone brought down from the main roster in Mandy Rose. Why was Mandy added to NXT here? Well, partially it was to give the brand a bit of star power, and partially it was to allow her to develop further in the ring. And boy did she do this, because it would be in October of that year that the Golden Goddess won the NXT Women's title, and from there proceeded to go on a 413-day long run with it. Yes, in the end, Mandy Rose would have the second longest run as NXT Women's Champion in history, with only the mighty Asuka being able to best her in that regard. And this is a hell of an achievement for someone who was never considered a workhorse of the division prior to that. Really, you could call 2021 the highlight of her entire career, a highlight which only happened because she went back down to developmental. But come 2022, it would be back over to the men's division, as the top NXT act of that 12-month period would be none other than Bron Breakker. Seriously, what a year Bron Breakker had in 2022. After all, it was here that he arrived on the scene in a major way when on the first NXT show of the year, he beat Tommaso Ciampa to become the new NXT World Champion. And in doing this then, he was able to firmly establish himself as the face of the 2.0 era, the man who would be carrying the whole brand on his back for the next while. But then Bron was always going to be an easy choice for this role anyway, as with his family lineage and his freakish physique, he was everything WWE were looking for in a next top star. Hell, so much did WWE clearly believe in Bron here, they'd give him the world title down in the developmental brand twice over the course of 2022. On top of that, anyone who challenged him would be absolutely destroyed before the match was over. By the time the year was coming to an end, in fact, the son of Rick Steiner was beating everyone around him with such ease, it was clear he was already outgrowing NXT. Honestly, it's rare to see someone so young and know already that they're destined to be the guy. But this was certainly the case with Bron Breakker at that point in time. Of course, with the revolving door nature of the developmental brand being what it is though, it meant there was always going to be someone who would come along and take the Georgia native's place as the ace by the time 2023 came around. And that's exactly what would happen when our next subject arrived on the scene. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Ilia Dragunov. Sure, 2023 wasn't Ilia Dragunov's debut on WWE TV. No, for a few years prior to that, he'd been working over on the British branch of the developmental league, NXT UK. In fact, he'd found so much success there that he'd even at one point been able to dethrone Gunther as the NXT United Kingdom champion, and from there go on to hold that belt for 346 days. That said, it would be in 2023 that he first fully arrived in NXT proper, when after a couple of injuries set him back for a while, he was able to win the world title there too. That's right, it was at the No Mercy PLE on September 30th that the Mad Russian was able to ascend to the top of the mountain when he got the better of then-champ Carmelo Hayes. And this would help NXT as a brand undergo a reversal in fortunes here, as now, with a wrestler of his caliber holding the title, a little bit of that old black and gold spark returned to the show. No, it wasn't the Triple H days anymore, but it was a significant step up from where the brand had been heading during lockdown. Could this reversal of fortunes for the developmental show be entirely put down to Ilia Dragunov? No, there were a lot of wrestlers who deserve credit for this, but the Moscow native played a bigger role than most. So that's why we have to consider him the best NXT act of 2023 then. And the groundwork Ilia was able to lay here would only continue to be built upon in 2024, as that was the year another top guy arose in the form of this year's best NXT wrestler, Trick Williams. Yes, while it seemed for a while like Trick Williams was going to be playing second fiddle to Carmelo Hayes, especially after Hayes won the NXT World title in April of 2023, 2024 would see the South Carolinian step out of his partner's shadow and fully become a star in his own right. And the way he did this was by being the man to beat Ilia Dragunov for the gold on April 23rd. What would Trick Willie do once the belt was around his waist? Well, he'd continue to prove he deserved to be the guy, as from here, he entered into a bitter feud with him. But that wasn't all Williams was doing during 2024 to make him the best wrestler in NXT. Though aside from battling his former partner, he'd be feuding with Ethan Page too. And it was during this feud with Page that Trick would lose and then win his gold back, something which made him a two-time world champion on the developmental brand. Clearly then, this was his year, one which will likely be looked back on as very important for him in years to come once he's presumably made it to the main roster and found success there. Of course, if things were slightly different, Trick Williams would probably be considered the top NXT act of 2025 too. He's still there as of the time of this video's recording after all, and he remains a key part of the show, with his TNA World title run being a heavily featured segment every week while it was happening. But with things the way they are, we have to go with someone else in his place when it comes to the midpoint of the 2020s. And the reason we say this is because there's now an even bigger star on top, both figuratively and literally. That's right. It's time for us to talk about Oba Femi. Now, Oba Femi is one of those guys who you just take one look at and know he's destined to be a star. Come on now, you'd have to be actively trying to botch a 6'6" former track and field star like him, someone who, aside from being an absolute physical specimen, is also a very talented wrestler in the ring. Luckily then, being botched was not something he'd have to worry about as, after spending a couple of years settling into the roster, it would be in 2025 that he reached the mountaintop to become NXT World Champion. How would the Lagos native do this? Well, after returning from injury and quickly climbing the card again, he'd eventually get his shot at Trick Williams on January 7th's New Year's Evil. And not letting this shot go to waste, the big man would make sure to walk out of the show with the gold around his waist. So it was then that from there, he'd go on to have a dominating run as the Ruler fully took over the main event scene down in the developmental brand, just like everyone knew he was one day destined to do. Sure, he might not still be in possession of the gold as of the time of this video's recording. Though ever since No Mercy on September 27th, it's been Ricky Saints who's been the champ, but that doesn't mean Oba can't win it back before the year is over, as there's still a couple of months left. And even if he doesn't do this, he'll still be the top NXT act of 2025, something which will forever give him a spot in the brand's history, along with everyone else we've looked at today.